Welcome back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. Today I have a very special guest with me, and that is the producer, recording engineer, and all-around champion of jazz music, George Klabin. Really excited to have him. Over his 60-year career, George has been a part of many eras of recorded jazz, from his time on the airwaves of Columbia University's WKCR to becoming a photographer and engineer for ESP Disk in the 60s, to starting his own studio and recording everyone from Dexter Gordon to Illinois Jacquette to Marion Brown, Weldon Irvine, Quincy Jones, Roy Ayers, Joe Chambers, Archie Shepp, Charles Tolliver, Art Blakey, and Albert Eiler, just to name a few of them. Today, you know George is the founder of Resonance Records, and I know many of us look forward to the label's releases every single record store day. He's also lately been taking his passions for Brazilian music, sort of coming full circle back to the radio airwaves, and releasing brand new albums of Brazilian jazz as well. There's so much to talk about, and we're going to get to all of it over the course of several segments that I'll actually be posting over the coming weeks. So do hit subscribe, and of course, stay tuned. So George, thanks very much for taking the time to chat with me today.
It's a pleasure. I'm glad that we are able to talk. I am a fan of yours, what you're doing, and it's really important to introduce people to good jazz and recordings, and to recall how records used to be made the best way, I think, for sound.
Yeah, but believe me, I wouldn't be able to talk about anything if we didn't have folks like you to have participated in the actual creation of this music. So let me kind of start with, like, how did you first arrive at jazz music? Like, what first drew you to the music?
Yes, I actually know how. I was about 6 years old. I would go to Brazil every summer in America, winter in Brazil, because they have the opposite seasons there. Because my mother divorced my father when I was 4, and she was in New York, which is where I was born and raised. But my father had, until I was 18, custody of me 3 months a year in Brazil, which was fabulous, because I wanted to be. I was very happy to be with my father, and I learned a great deal about the culture of Brazil, and I was given a wind-up Victrola when I was 6, because my father, this is in 1952, so I go back. And so there was the hi-fi records, or long-playing records, that started about 1950, microgroove. And so he was buying these in the early 50s, he was buying these microgroove records, and he said he didn't need his wind-up Victrola anymore, so he gave it to me like a toy, and I loved it. It's the kind that has the speaker in the head. You set down the head with the needle on the spinning disc, and 78 RPM, And so he gave me a whole bunch of 78s, and among them was I think probably what was the most closest to jazz and got me interested at that age was a recording of from a musical. The actual song that was on the record on one side was "Come On to My House," which was a big hit back then, and it was the very first record ever made that was not a classical record with a harpsichord. It had a harpsichord solo, and it was a jazz solo, and that was very interesting to me. And the other record was Fred Astaire, "They All Laughed," and there was on the back side of the record, the 78, was "Slap That Bass," which was done as in a. I remember seeing the movie later and seeing it was a bass player as part of the orchestra in a club, and they gave him a bass solo. So he's playing this sound, and I had no idea. I'm 6 years old. I'd never heard anything like this, but it was fascinating. It really interested me, and it was a jazz-like solo. So I would say that was the absolute beginning of my love of jazz.
Did you feel like you wanted to participate in the music industry growing up? So you start with that, and obviously you ended up, you went to Columbia University and started getting more involved. But in those in the in-between time, did you feel like this was something that you wanted to do?
Well, yes, but not specifically the industry that I ended up in. It was more performing, not me performing, but working with jazz musicians. And I remember going to, when I was about 12 or 13, I was in love with boogie woogie, and that was my first real love of jazz. That I could go out and buy records in stores. The Strand, which is a famous bookstore in New York, they had a whole bunch of these records that were put away in a room because nobody wanted them anymore. Because by the time I was going there, the LP was it. So I, for $1 or less, whatever it was, they gave, you could buy anything you wanted. So I was looking through them. I was buying them some boogie woogie stuff, and I bought it and so on. And that was really enjoyable. So, but what developed from that was I wanted to hear some musicians that played it. And Dorothy Donegan, who, as a fabulous pianist, she played a lot of boogie woogie and related types of swinging piano jazz. So she would play in New York at a place called the Embers, which is a well-known jazz club in that 52nd Street area, but it was on the east side. 52nd Street stuff was more on, I think, on the west side. And there was a Hickory House there, which I also used to go to. Those were what was left of the great run of clubs that used to be on that street. So anyway, I would be taken. Of course, I was a kid, couldn't go alone, but I'd be taken there. There was a good restaurant, and then what I did, I was very bold. I don't know how I did this. I was after she played a set, I would go up and talk to her at the piano, and I would say, "Hi, you're great. I really like what and nobody did that, not kids. So she really liked it, and she actually remembered me because I went a couple of times over a period of time that she'd be playing there, a year or two. And so it was nice. And I love Boogie Woogie. And where that led to was after a few years, I started buying records at Sam Goody's, which was a very famous store chain. And I remember the records were like $4 each or something. It's back in that time. It's amazing. And that was a lot of money, actually. It wasn't that cheap. But so then I think the next thing that happened that was interesting was I went to high school, and I went to a school that was like a boarding school where you lived there. And I told the management of the school, people that ran it, that I was friendly with, would it be okay if I brought a jazz group to the school? Because I thought that would be something they'd enjoy. And they said, yes, it would. And yes, you can do that. Now when I was in New York, um, I was going to the Hickory House. Now we're talking about the Hickory House. There's a great steakhouse. Now I was probably 15 at that point. And this guy, Howard Reynolds, who you may never have heard of. Howard Reynolds was uh, a really good black jazz pianist who played at the Hickory House with a trio. And he was as good in some ways as Tatum. I mean, he had some Tatum in him. And he could swing, and he was a pretty young guy and a very nice guy. So I've befriended him again. After the set, I went up and talked to him, and he actually invited me to his home once. And he was married to a young lady, who they had a child together who's maybe 4 years old. She goes over to the piano, starts playing the piano. I'm like, oh my God, a prodigy. So anyway, I said, hey, would you like to play at I called him. This is now skipping ahead. I was in school. I probably my second year there. I called him and said, would you like to come and play? Can you bring your group? And sure enough, they went there and played. So I was now an entrepreneur, whatever you want to call it, booking agent, whatever. And but it was fun. So that would be my start.
No, this is fascinating. I mean, these days, so many of these clubs, like the Embers or like the Hickory House, you don't, we don't have access to them, and even if we did, they would be different. I mean, we kind of have the Vanguard, and we have a few sort of reinvigorations of Mintons and stuff like that, but it's just different, and so it's just fascinating to me, and I'm sure many others that you're able to see some of that, even if some of it was at the sort of last vestiges of maybe even what it was in the, say, the 40s or
But it
50s.
was still operating as if it wasn't in Las Vegas. The club itself was fine. It was still having jazz. It was still, the same way it was for decades. It's just there were less of them. And eventually both of those disappeared. And then I would find jazz wherever I could. But then I started going to jazz clubs like the Vanguard and so on. That started just a little bit later. So really what I found was that I really liked this. And so I went to college at Columbia University when I was in 1964 after I graduated from high school, and immediately decided, oh, I should mention one thing. I was given a tape recorder several years earlier, probably they had consumer tape recorders, reel to reel, that they would sell. Um, Probably Bogan or one of those brands. I can't remember the name. And I had it for a while, and I would play announcers things. I would talk and pretend I was an announcer, and I was like a jazz DJ. I would listen to the radio and imitate that, and so I had a lot of fun with that. So I was already, sort of in the direction of being a DJ. And so I went to the radio station, which is run by one of the students. And I said, I'd like to know if there's any room for me to do a jazz show. And he said, well, it's interesting you say that, because the guy who did all our jazz program, he graduated and we have nobody. So I said, aha. So what would you like me to do to show you that I can do this? And he said, there's an AM station that, in those days, they actually had an AM station that only broadcast through the electrical system of the entire college dorms. I mean, crazy. So
Wow.
he said, we have this station, and you can go on the station, and I'll listen. We'll have a time, and I'll listen to you, and I'll check you out. So what I did is I spent hours preparing a show on the history of bebop, and I still have all the tapes. Um, I still have them. I mean, there's
Wow.
what is that? 50 years or something, 60 years. I don't know. Long time. And I did a really good job. I had all the recordings by then. I would go to the record stores. I would buy the 78 RPMs. I found Rainbow Records, the first bebop, Coleman Hawkins. You know that the very first recorded jazz that was called bebop was with Coleman Hawkins, Dizzy Gillespie, and somebody else, I forget, and it was on Rainbow Records. So I
Wow.
got that, I had it, and I found the record that Charlie Parker's solo was on Decca. That was the first solo that he ever did, which was Sepia and Bounce with Jay McShann's band. Could you believe that? I went to a record store, and the guy had all these, again, he had all this crap. You can look through it, but this guy, thank God, he memorized the entire catalog of RCA Victor records that he used to sell. He's an old guy, and he was always dealing with 78s. And he actually could tell me which if I said the name, he could tell me the number, or one of those, the phone book, like the phone book. Anyway, he said, look over there. I think those records that you're asking for are there. I found them there. I couldn't believe it, in perfect condition. So I bought them, and they were like $1 each, whatever. So I had all this stuff, and I put this whole thing together. And remember, this is back then. There's no internet. There's no, it's everything is, you have to go out and get it and deal with it. It's a completely different world. But I did it, and he was very impressed. And he said to me, you got a show. So I ended up doing a show called Jazz Till Midnight every Sunday from 9 to midnight. That was how I started. And so after I did the show for a little while, and I did it pretty successfully, I realized that to get listeners, I had to do several things. One is I had to find ways to keep them coming back. And one of the ways to do that was I was approached by a magazine called Jazz Magazine, which had just started not that long before I was on the air. So now we're talking 1965, probably is when I started. And they said, we'll give you free subscriptions or free trial subscriptions if you want to give them away. So I would be on the phone saying, okay, we have a contest now. I'm going to play a sax player or whatever it was, and you name the lead guy, whatever, it be a sax or be pianist, and call this number. And I had a phone in the control room, and because of the music, I would have 5-10 minutes or more between between talking, so people would call me, and sure enough, you know who called me a lot? Mike Kuskuna. You believe that? He was 13 years old or 14 years old. He's still in high school, and he's winning all the contests. He's so good. I said, wow, who could forget a name like Kuskuna anyway, right? So
Right.
so that's, again, there's all these connections I was making, all became part of my jazz life as time went on. Um, and so then I said, you know what? I want to record some original music that only can be heard on my show. In other words, it's not going to be on a record, and you have to tune into my show to hear it. So I went. Do you know what the October Revolution was? 1964, when all the black musicians in New York, the wonderful black creators of what we'll call avant-garde music. They got together, formed a consortium, and said, "We're going to in October, we're going to book um, theaters, we're going to book clubs, which they did in advance, and advertise. We're going to all put our money together, buy newspaper ads, magazine, blah, 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 and we're going to bring this music, this new music, to the public in New York." And so the West Side Cafe, which is a famous cafe right near Columbia University, I don't know if it's still there, but it was there for a long time after I left and before. They had jazz. They were a jazz club. And so one night, I guess during that October period, I sauntered over there to just check it out. And they were having some avant-garde jazz. All I remember is Rashid Ali was the drummer. I don't remember who was playing with him, but I'm sure they were top people in that, that consortium. And here's the most important thing that came out of it. Honestly, I wasn't a big fan of the music because I'm more of interested in straight ahead jazz. But there was a young man recording the music on an Ampex tape recorder. And I was very interested in tape recorders and all of that anyway, because I had bought, no, I hadn't bought a tape recorder yet. I was going to buy a tape recorder, excuse me. So I was very interested in that equipment. And I asked him, who are you doing this for? And he said, well, these guys are paying me to do it, but I work with Jerry Newman. Bingo. You heard of Jerry Newman.
Oh, sure.
I had read about Jerry Newman in a book by one of the I don't know if it was Whitney Balliet or one of these people that wrote books on jazz back then, right? And he said there was this guy who was at Columbia University when he in the 40s, and he went and recorded in Minton's, and he gave away he was famous for giving away bird solos that were recorded that he didn't like, so he gave the discs away. So God knows what happened to them, piece of history. So I said, "Oh, I would love to meet Jerry Newman, and I think I'd love to have him on my show, and so on." And this was I didn't even have the show yet, but I was planning. So he gave me the phone number. I called him up. He's very nice. I went over to him. He lived on 22nd. I'm sorry. His studio was on 22nd Street, and I went there and had a nice meeting with him. And at some point, maybe the second time I went there, he said, "I have some things to play for you." I was there in the 40s, and I recorded. Unbelievable. You listen to this, and he plays somebody playing epistrophe in stride. I said, "That's epistrophe." "Yeah, that's Thelonious Monk." I said, "What do you mean? He didn't play like that." He said, "Yes, he did. He was only 19 or whatever. That's how he played. He hadn't developed his style yet." Unbelievable, right? So I said, "Wow, and what else?" And he had all kinds of stuff. Art Tatum, tons of Art Tatum, and this and that. So I said, "Look, can I play this on my radio show? I would really like to, because then I can tell everybody they can only hear it once, and I'll only play it once." And he said, "Okay, but I'll prepare a copy for you with tones." You understand what that means, right?
So they played with tones so that people who were listening wouldn't record it and then essentially bootleg it, right?
That's what it was. Okay. So anyway, he gave me this recording with the tones on it. And when I put it on, first of all, I told people next week I'm going to have this incredible recording. Be sure to come and listen to this. This is history, never before played in public ever in the history of the world. This music is so important. The great players, blah, blah, blah. And then when I played it, I also explained that next week that you will be hearing these little tones to protect the gentleman, Jerry Newman, and so on. So everybody understood. But I think what I was always doing, I was so innovative. I was almost like trying to market this, to have people come. So I would be giving away. So I would get people who had jazz clubs would call me and say, "We'll give you some tickets for the weekend for the show. Give it away, on your phone calls and so on." So I was like a machine that was doing legal stuff like that, advertising in the way that nobody could say it was not, because it was a nonprofit station. You're not supposed to have ads.
One thing that I found, and I don't know if how this made it on the internet, or maybe it's something that you helped put out there, but I heard an interview that you did, I think, of Bill Evans at some point. Was that during was that while you worked at Columbia University's radio station, and did you have access to a lot of artists?
Yeah, I had access to him because I booked 1965, which would be my second year there, probably in the fall. I booked a jazz concert. I went and did the same thing I did in my high school. I went to management there at the college. I said, "Hey, can I book a jazz concert? I have very good connections here with I'm on the radio. They knew who I was. They said, okay. So I had Freddie Hubbard and Sheila Jordan. And guess who was managing Sheila Jordan? Bill Evans' manager, Helen Keane. So we formed a friendship. And Helen Keane lived 2 blocks from where my parents lived in New York. I was in the dorm, but I'm a New Yorker basically. And several years later, I was called by Bernard Stolman. Bernard Stolman had just started his record label, and he was putting out these avant-garde jazz recordings, and so he said, "Would you play these on the air?" So I said, "Okay." I didn't like them, Albert Eiler and a few others. I didn't particularly like the music, but I said it's important to play this music. This is brand new, and I'll be among the first to play it because I was getting the very first discs, which ESP discs, that was a brand, which today are collector's items, I guess.
Oh, sure.
So then I was also a photographer, and I would take photos in clubs and send it to the magazines, and sometimes they'd use it and pay me $50 or something. So I said, Lowell Davidson. Have you ever heard of Lowell Davidson? He was a jazz pianist.
I have, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he signed Lowell Davidson. This probably was a few months after we started having our relationship. And he said, "I'm going to record him at Bell Sound." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'll come along and I'll take some photos for you." So I shot photos and I ended up with the cover photo. So if you have that Lowell Davidson, you'll see my credit on the back.
So I was actually going to ask you about this specifically because so the interesting thing, and this is just pure coincidence, is that that record either came out or actually I think it was recorded in July of 1965, and here we are, we're almost we're 60 years later to the almost to the month,
Almost to the month,
and that was your first I think 2 credits as far as I could tell were as a photographer for ESP Disk. How did you then, so one that I just kind of pulled up, right, that I believe you recorded is Why Not, Marion Brown.
I'll tell you that story.
Yeah, I'm curious how you made this pivot, from photography to record. All right, so as I mentioned at the top, we're going to be covering this conversation over the course of several videos. So be on the lookout for our continued conversation where we'll hear more stories from George Klabin's life and his experiences in the music industry. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you next time.